So, government intervention or self-regulation, Josie?
I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in being able to express yourself freely. I also believe that there's a lot of self-interest, and there does need to be some type of government oversight.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think there's a difference between freedom of speech and abuse, and that's just when we're talking about stuff that's on the internet, right? As far as censorship, but when we talk about data privacy and data ownership, um, I believe the government needs to get involved and help regulate how data is shared because it's personal data, it's assets. Um, yes, the government does not tell me how to store my belongings, but if they were to get stolen, well, there's a law, there's a code in there that deals with burglaries, right? So I think the government definitely have to get involved into regulating how the data ownership
Well,
is managed.
well, I feel like the tech industry is relatively new. I mean, it didn't really go mainstream until the personal computer was available back in the 90s and the internet was available, right? So it's a relatively young industry, 20, 30 years. I mean, you have other industries that have been around for hundreds of years, right? So those industries have some type of regulatory body that creates certain amount of standards on what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And as a mom, the way I see this is it's kind of like you have two kids and they're fighting and bickering, right? Two very different people, two very different viewpoints, right? But the mom or the dad are there to regulate and create standards on, look, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, these are the guardrails, and just stay between it, right? So they're both allowed to have self-expression, but they need to comply with certain norms and standards that are for the placed there for the well-being of everyone. I do need, there does need to be some type of regulatory body that doesn't, over censor, but it does create a certain level or a standard for and an environment where everybody's thoughts are kind of shared.
Yeah, I agree with that. But that takes us to another topic, which is the censorship, right? So the data, the content is there. It's on a platform, right? It belongs to the person who actually published it. But that data, some of it is private. It stays within that person's profile. But some of that data, the content, is actually public. It gets posted. It gets shared by different people. And so the first part is easier to regulate, I believe. It's because private data, it's not out there unless the platform decides to put it out there, right? And then so if I put my age on a social platform, I get to choose whether I want to show everybody my age or not. And if I choose not to, well, the platform knows about it, and it's really my data. Whether they do something with it or not, which they usually do, right, through advertising, targeted advertising, that remains to be regulated in a sense, but I don't even know if you could do that in a sense because they have the private terms of use and privacy and all that stuff. Usually all the big guys have it covered. I think the difficult part is the content that you put out there, the public one, right? And when you post something for everybody else to consume, well, now there's the big question of, well, is it really freedom of speech or should we regulate what gets posted? Because you have freedom of speech versus harmful speech versus misinformation. So at what point can the government distinguish which is which and what potential guardrails or rules can the government put in there, right? It becomes very difficult for the government to intervene in the public posted content.
That's what I mean by a regulatory body. So, for example, you have equal rights and protection clause, right? And that these are like actual cases that went to court and they went through the entire judicial process. And now there's legal clause and legal stipulations that, companies have to adhere to the equal rights and privacy law, right? But they went through the entire judicial. We haven't had enough cases that basically go and test these laws that are out there and apply them to the tech world. So, for example, you mentioned terms of use and privacy, right? A lot of terms of use and privacy, like stipulations for tech companies, basically it says, the minute you put your information in here, I own it. 100%. Regardless of whether it's a social security or a phone number or an ID.
And I get to use it however I see fit.
And I get to use it however I see fit, whether it's commercial or non-commercial use, right? There should be some laws around how they utilize our information, right? But there hasn't been a case yet where it tests these assumptions and it forces, the judicial bodies to make a stance on this is what we're going to do or this is what we're not going to do, because it's so new.
Europeans have been a little bit more advanced with GDPR, and they kind of they've tried to put some kind of limits as to what companies can do with one's personal data. Locally in the US, I think HIPAA, on the healthcare perspective, that's probably one of the most protected data laws out there. So data, I think it's probably easier to set up some rules and come up with that committee that will set those rules for who gets to use what data for what. I think content, on the other hand, content moderation in particular, what makes it difficult is, well, number one, people spit whatever they feel like saying. Number two, you could not put a monitor for every single publisher. It just doesn't make sense. And number three, there is differences in cultures that what's offensive to you might not be offensive to me. What's harmful to you might not be harmful. Now, misinformation is misinformation regardless. There's only one truth. It's a different perspective, but there's only one truth. And but when it comes to harmful, like what's an insult and what's not, I think it's very cultural, and it's going to be very difficult to regulate that without today's technology, without AI, I believe. I think AI is going to play a major role in global content moderation efforts.
Yeah, so this I'm just screaming cultural colonization. So one perspective versus many perspectives, right? And the way you get the richest answers or the richest solutions is by having different perspectives come together, right? So globalization has allowed us to kind of see the perspective of one geolocation versus another geolocation, utilize the resource from one geolocation and optimize it in another one where they might not have that readily available. But it also creates what you just mentioned, difference in opinions. Do we all want to start thinking the same way? Do we want to create a like global colony that thinks the same way, or do we want to embrace these differences and kind of create these different colors of gray, right? So for example, you can have a culture that is very respectful of the elderly, right? And they take good care of them, and they respect them a lot. They take care of them. And then you have a more like individualistic society where maybe they respect them, but it's every man for themselves type of perspective, right? So when you're going to program something or create a standard of something, who would you value more? The elderly and the entire family as a whole, or the individual perspective, right? And there is no right or wrong. It's just different thoughts and different perspectives. So the question is, do we want to become one way of thinking and colonize ourselves at a global level, or do we want to embrace these different cultures? And when we think about that, that's when we start to say, okay, what type of standards do we create?
I think there's a way to obviously I mean, we're all different. We all have our own ways of thinking, our values, and we all cherish those values and want to keep them. I think the biggest, it's easier to force one set of values. It's from a technical perspective, it's easier to moderate that way, right? Because if you don't agree with me, I'm going to delete your content. But I do believe there is a way where we can actually take a set of standards of acceptable value, of acceptable behaviors and speech within a certain culture, and moderate that content based on where it's being delivered. There's the technology, I believe, is there today to allow us to do that. I think that it's important also to be able to allow others to explore the content from different cultures, from what's considered acceptable in culture A might be banned in culture B, but as a culture B user, I would like to have the right to enable myself to be exposed to culture A in a sense, so that I can broaden my horizon. Now, to do that, I think there's needs to be a certain standardization of moderation. What I mean by that is most of the people nowadays live on social media. I mean, it used to be people got their information from websites, and then before that used to be newspapers, and before that, I don't know what was before the newspapers. But today you get everything in one place, in one feed. And now China has its own rules, so whoever wants to do business in China has to follow those rules. TikTok is an amazing example. TikTok in China, if you're a kid, you get shorts of little whiz kids doing incredible math and doing some amazing physics stuff and being like incredible artists, right? And if you're a kid and you use TikToks here, well, you see bunnies eating lettuce and jumping out of a fire hoop, or you see an ice bucket challenge, or you see things that don't necessarily add value to your mental development. And I think that is where the governments can come in. And if you want to have users in my country and you want to have that revenue from that traffic that you get from my country, then these are the rules you need to follow. That's
How much of it would be the algorithm that was baked into the platform? So the algorithm of the platform is meant to attract more views, right? So if you have a user who's interacting with, I don't know, content A, and they keep on interacting with content A, then they're going to be fed more content A, right?
Correct. And that's kind of the thing with AI in general and algorithms in general, is that they're driven by the outcome that is desired from the input they give it. So if you feed it data, and then some of particular set of that data leads to the results that you want, which is more users, more viewers. So the algorithm is only as good as the data you feed it, and its goal is to keep giving the results that you want from it. Now, you could use something called data bias, where sometimes you don't feed it enough data that covers the whole spectrum, and it keeps giving you bias results that is geared towards the data you fed it, bias to that data. Well, that's probably the most difficult thing about AI, right? Is that you don't want to get data bias. But in this particular case, data bias is a good thing, because you want that AI to stay limited within the constraint of those guardrails that you set for it. And you do it via bias.
Could
right?
that be considered brainwashing, though? Like, I get where you're coming with that, where it's like, okay, this is the algorithm. The algorithm is meant to receive as many views as possible. If you're feeding it content A and they're consuming content A, just give them more of the content A, right? And then now you've got a regulatory body stepping in to create standards that says, don't feed more than 70% of content A. Make sure to put in 10% of content B, because we want them to learn content B.
Correct. Yes, absolutely, it is. I guess, it's no different than back in the day when there was very few TV stations, and between 4 and 7 p.m. when children come back from school, there's nothing but children programs, right?
Oh my God,
So
Schoolhouse
it's like,
Rock.
So it's like, yes, the brainwashing has always been there, right? Or we can call it guidance or whatever you want to call it. I guess the real question is, who do you want to be brainwashed by, the government or the platforms? Because as far as brainwashing is concerned,
So the greater evil, just pick one.
pick one. It's either the government or the platforms through the sponsors and the advertisers within the platform. So I believe there's like a middle ground that we can attain there. But at the end of the day, I believe there is a way out, and the way out is for the government to start understanding the technology and start understanding how they can curb some of the not unwanted behavior that our next generation is being exposed to.
Yeah. Look, I agree. As I said, the internet is somewhat new, 20, 30 years old. Our children, unfortunately, are guinea pigs of what's happening, right? And we're all learning, right? I think the most important thing is to stay open-minded. And if things need to be optimized or changed, for us to stay open-minded around that and not knee-jerk, well, it's my privacy and freedom of speech. Yes, privacy and freedom of speech, right? But we also need to have some type of standard or control around data and privacy. And I do think it's time for somebody to step in and give some type of guardrails, because there is very little now.
Plus, I have a little problem with this freedom of speech concept online in particular. I don't believe in freedom of speech if it's anonymous. In other words, if you have the right to say whatever you want, but you also have to declare who you are. You have to stand up and say, hey, you know what? I don't like color red, right? But then you have all these anonymous accounts that come in and start posting all this stuff, and they kind of get filtered. They get protected by the known accounts who are really saying something, who are putting their name out there to defend an idea. And then you have all these bogus accounts that come in and start feeding all kind of propaganda under the name of freedom of speech. I believe there needs to be some kind of a moderated online identity standard where Josie has her online social security number, and that's who you are, and so is Kareem, and so everybody else. And I think when we get there, you'll be able to. It's like the check for Twitter, right? The verified thing.
Verified, yeah.
It's something like that where you can actually verify it. And when we get to that, I believe we don't even need to sign up for stuff anymore. Your data doesn't need to be with any platform anymore. If we're able to get something like that in place, and through blockchain, we could definitely do something like that. It's very technically very doable. Where now, if you don't want to allow people, like if you have, say you go to sign up for an online platform and you have to be 13 years old, well, you don't have to put your age in that platform and hit sign in. No, you can go to this online identity provider, and the platform doesn't even need to ask for your age. They just have to ask the question, are they over 13 or not? And the platform will return yes or no. So that's one way to, number one, protect our data, our privacy, so that we own it. So if I want to get off a platform, well, I'm just disconnecting it from my online identity provider. And number two, it verifies us. So that freedom of speech is truly the freedom of speech of an individual, not some keyboard somewhere that we don't even know if it's manned or not. So I think that's the issue I have with the freedom of speech online in particular.
Yeah, again, a perfect example of that, and I hate to name drop, is Glassdoor, for example. You have employers who are verified and who are asked to verify and put their name on there, right? But ex-employees or prospective employees are allowed to put any type of feedback on there, and it's completely anonymous. And the employer has zero ability to know who did it and even make it right. Let's say that some of the concerns are valid. You can't even address them.
Yeah, and you can even, well, that's again, right? Anonymosity, right? Like, how do you know that that person really worked at that organization? Anybody can log in and put anything about anybody. but there's no way for you to verify that link did exist in the past or not. So I think we have a long way to go when it comes to data.
And I think that the reasoning behind that is, well, it's their perspective, and their perspective is true to them. Yeah, well, I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that I have perspectives on.
Might not be the truth.
It might not be the truth, right? But it is sold as this is the truth, right?
Yeah. So I think that's perspective, opinion, all that stuff is subject to interpretation. Right? It's not necessarily the truth. So that's kind of why, in my opinion, there needs to be a categorization of internet content. Like when I go somewhere, it tells me that, the Hollywood is in Los Angeles, California. Okay, yes. It has some kind of a mark that says it is in Hollywood, California, right? Now, there's another Hollywood in Florida also. That could also be true, but we might not be talking about the same Hollywood. I need to be able to understand that it's not the same one. And I think right now, you can put things out of context very easily and everybody will believe it. So yeah, we need governance when it comes to the world of internet.
Yeah.
In general.
So you heard it from us, two people in tech. Look, we're totally fine, and we're pro creating some type of standard and some governance. So I think most people would assume that people in tech are against it.
No, actually, most people in tech are actually for it. I think people in tech are the ones that know the potential dangers of AI and rogue content and misinformation. And it's going to get worse if we don't put standards today on things that are going to be auto-generated in the future. So, well, very interesting conversation. Thanks again, Josie, for this amazing conversation. We should have a follow-up.
Yes, and don't sue us, TikTok or Glassdoor, for mentioning those things. Just to give a tangible or a real perspective or kind of a case study, I think it was helpful.
Well, thanks all for being with us. Please share, like, and subscribe. And we'll see you all next time.